The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested.
The road to the top had been a difficult one. Now that he was here, the executive found that it had all been justified. Anything was worth it for even 10 minutes of being the owner of this office. He looked out of the window and watched the bustling of the metropolis in the afternoon sun. Tens of thousands of Mac cars levitated along tracks snaking up and around hundreds of skyscrapers. The vehicles were manufactured by his company, as were the tracks. They had bought most of the architecture firms, complaining that this transportation network would severely limit their design options, bankrupted others, and forced the holdouts to comply with their vision of the city with a series of expensive dinners for members of parliament. Out on the sparkling sea, freighters the size of towns shipped containers with his company's logo on them to ports on this world and beyond. The executive himself had orchestrated the privatization and purchase of several major global ports some years ago, and made it so only company ships could be serviced there without a ridiculous markup. The executive swiped over the window and the scenery changed. He was now no longer seeing southward, but to the west, where great mountains towered over even the greatest of buildings. The old observatory looked as pristine as ever, even though no observing had been done in that complex for over a decade. It had been his idea to turn it into a luxury hotel, and the research data proving that the science being conducted there was no longer worth anything had been easy to fake. Out of sight, at much higher altitudes, his company's mining operation was pulling some of the most valuable raw materials known to man out of the ground. There had been environmental concerns at first, but proving that the species the activists considered threatened were already extinct had not been too difficult. The executive cracked his knuckles and sat down at his workstation. Iris scan, DNA test, secret passcode, and brainwave analysis were the steps necessary to gain the kind of top-level access he had lobbied for back when he was only a desk jockey. Only the highest commander of the company got it, and it offered complete control of all computer systems, while at the same time being impossible to trace. Nobody would ever know that anything had been done. It was time to get to work. He had cleaning to do. First was a councilman he'd bribed. The man had been greedy and not satisfied with fancy dinners and donations to retirement funds. The executive respected that, but he had dirt on him, and was thus a liability. All he had to do was press a button, and the system made his car slip off the tracks and plummet to destruction. It made it look as though the councilman's chauffeur had committed suicide with his boss on board. A journalist who was investigating said councilman's corruption was lured outside of his apartment by a call from his daughter, and crushed in the hallway by a fire door. The safeties had failed and the mechanic responsible had been identified. There was a gas explosion in his home that night, eliminating him and his family as witnesses. No cause could ever be found. A different councilman, young and idealistic at the time, had not accepted any bribes. So anonymous terrorists had kidnapped his wife, and he became the building code law's most vocal sponsor. Both the councilman and his wife were sucked out of their penthouse when a sudden pressure drop ripped out the windows. A tragic accident, as nobody saw the industrial drone that made the pressure drop happen in the first place. The terrorists, who lived in the mountains, were killed when their explosives suddenly detonated on their own. Though they hadn't stolen them, reports of their theft were created and dated to months prior to protect the company from blowback. Nobody should be able to claim that they sold weapons to terrorists, or that those weapons sometimes malfunctioned. A murderer in a prison received a reliable message from an anonymous source. The pedophile architect that had so vehemently denied wrongdoing every time they had beaten him up was the man who killed his daughter all those years ago. In a rage, he killed the architect in the hallway before being injected with a tranquilizer dart by an automated turret. The dosage determined by the machine was too high, and the murderer was also killed. All records of any messages were empty. In a distant country, a homeless man was accidentally beaten to death by a security robot. Luckily, the company manufactured no components of this robot, at least officially. There was a single off-brand chip installed in the visual cortex of the robot, but nobody could trace its production back to the company. The fact that the homeless man killed was once the head of the city's port authority and vehemently opposed to its privatization was a minor footnote in the news report. A curiosity that placed most of the focus on the fact that he had been ousted without pension for misappropriating funds in bad faith, a conviction he had always denied. In a different distant country, a police officer obsessed with the murder of a lawyer that had remained unsolved for years fell into a hole. Just like that, the street swallowed him when a garbage hatch opened underneath him, and he was disintegrated in the automated waste disposal system. Nothing like this had ever happened. Nothing like this would ever happen again. The company had made that system totally secure, and nobody even suspected them. While alive, the lawyer had worked for an advocacy group lobbying against the ridiculous markups the company was charging. At the time, he had been devising a strategy that would have demonstrated the illegality of what the company was doing to its competition in a court of law. His murder had sent a clear message, as had the destruction of all his hard drives and backups, but it had been clean and could never be traced back to the company. Even the hitman had been eliminated. The old scientist who used to run the observatory and was now growing senile in a mental institution had an aneurysm and passed away peacefully. No autopsy would ever be able to determine that the nanobots that were keeping his blood flow going were manufactured by the company, as they all dissolved without a trace on command, and all paperwork of their installation was wiped from the databases of the company and the mental institution. It was a trick the executive had used many years earlier, taking advantage of the fact that almost all computer systems in the world were manufactured by a subsidiary of the company. It was the same method he had used to manipulate the observatory's data in order to gaslight the old scientist. Compounds that damaged brain tissue were delivered in the meals the old scientist got through a food company that could track where their product went. Creepy messages were sent to subordinates, until finally his tailored medicine was laced with mild hallucinogens. The analysis machines monitoring the old scientist's blood never picked those up. They, too, were manufactured by the company. Several kilometers inland, the manager of a chemical facility owned by the company found himself having an unexpected heart attack as his pacemaker failed. The man had grown old at a young age, always carrying around a secret heavier than he could bear. He'd been instrumental in creating the chemicals necessary to annihilate the endemic species around the area where the mines were supposed to be built. The house of the environmental inspector who had declared the site free of dangerous toxins at the time was flooded with poison gas from his basement laboratory. After he was dead, the windows opened, and the gas dissipated into the air, never to be seen again. His son had been dying of an extremely rare disease at the time, and the executive had offered him a spot in a top-secret experimental treatment program if the inspector faked the report. The boy had died. There had been no program. While training unarmed combat with a dummy bot, the company's security president had his neck broken. A terrible accident, but the machine would have been too stupid to actually do him any harm. As a matter of fact, he designed parts of it himself. Files from his personal and office workstations regarding an investigation into the death of the last executive were wiped without a trace. All it took from the executive was 10 minutes of work. The system he had designed pervaded the entire company and all its subsidiaries, communicating across products, piggybacking on a software suite that nobody understood because it had been grown by neural networks. It was clandestine. Nobody knew of its existence. Imbued with superhuman problem-solving capabilities, it required oversight from one person, and one person alone, the executive himself. There were no loose ends, no mouths that could talk, no soldiers that had issues pulling the trigger. Nobody could defeat it. Nothing was faster than the system because the company owned the only one of its kind, and no one but the executive even knew about it. All these years he had played the game with paranoia, the fear of being discovered always gnawing at the rims of his consciousness. Now he was the executive, and he was untouchable. He would never have to be afraid again.
If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.